How are we doing this morning?
Good.
Got power? Got power? Power blood? It's finally over. It's relief for some, depression for others. If you haven't heard, American Idol is finished. Any American Idol fans in here? Marcus, American Idol fan? No? No?
No.
So, if you haven't heard, it's been 15 seasons. I didn't realize that. 15 seasons. And they just, I don't know how long ago, I think it was this last month, they crowned the last contestant, the final contestant in American Idol. And it was watched by over 13 million people who wanted to kind of see this close out. Now, actually, earlier on in the series, it had even a bigger audience than that. In fact, it was at one point in time one of the highest rated shows on American television. It was a phenomenon, and it was kind of like, what's going on with that? And it, of course, has spawned several spin-offs. You still have The Voice going on today. That came out of kind of the American Idol experience. America's Got Talent, all these kind of reality talent shows. And it was really a phenomenon. And so what exactly is going on with that? One writer suggested that the reason for the popularity was because of audience participation. Right? That, there's a certain point early on, of course, where the judges are making all the decisions, but then later on, it became all about the audience. And so you, as a viewer, got to have input into who won. And of course, we like that power, and so that perhaps is probably some of it. But I think there's something else going on here. The same writer suggested another reason. Here's what he said. He said, not watching the show can put people at a social disadvantage because discussion of the show is a hot topic almost anywhere a person goes. That's why I started watching it in season 2. I was sick of everyone I knew talking about it and feeling like I was an outcast because I knew nothing about the show. And that's true of a lot of different shows or different kinds of things in our society. It's like you don't want to be on the outside. So you have this cultural pressure that forces you to do certain things. And I think that's the way our culture is. It often influences us, telling us all kinds of things, like what we should wear, what we should watch, what we should listen to. And we've all perhaps been influenced by it and shaped by it, and in some sense controlled by it. In fact, I had this kind of traumatic experience myself early on in my Lipscomb career. When I first started teaching at Lipscomb, of course, it was kind of standard wear to have a tie in those days. And so I would typically, especially in the warm weather, I would have a short sleeve dress shirt with a tie. Not realizing that was kind of fashion faux pas. I don't know why it was. It seemed a very practical, seasonable choice for me. And so I would wear that thinking, I was complying. I had my nice tie on there, but I had short sleeves on. And then one of my colleagues and friends decided to use me as an illustration in chapel, in front of 2,000 students, calling me out for my fashion faux pas and saying, don't be like this. And so, of course, there was a pressure there. What do I do at that moment? Do I continue wearing my short sleeve dress shirt and tie? Of course, the answer was no, I couldn't. All my fashion credibility had been lost. In fact, I never again wore that kind of outfit. In fact, I very rarely even wear a short sleeve dress shirt at this point. And so that's the cultural pressure, right? It's kind of caving in. You gotta, don't forget what your own style is or what you think is comfortable. You gotta conform to what everybody else says and what everybody else thinks. And we are constantly faced with those kinds of pressures by our culture. Sometimes in subtle and other times not so subtle ways, telling us what's important and what you should think about, what you should value. And so this morning we're kind of beginning a short series of lessons exploring some of the values and priorities that our culture has told us that we should have, trying to convince us that these things are worth our ultimate concern. So we're going to call this kind of a series on American Idols, and it's about elements of our culture that can seduce us into believing that they should be the center of our existence. And these are ideas and values that oftentimes aren't necessarily bad in and of themselves. It's only when They want to be true objects of worth and value for us, the center of our attention, that they become, in some sense, new forms of idolatry. And so this first week I want to talk a little bit about idolatry and Israel's struggle with it. As you might remember, Israel was constantly faced with the challenge of idolatry. They struggled with it from their earliest inception. In fact, you might remember that Abraham and his entire family were idol worshippers before God called him into relationship with God. And so it continues on throughout that story. So you might remember, just kind of reflecting on this, when Jacob and Rachel were fleeing from her father Laban, do you remember that in the story, Laban figures out that his household gods are missing. And he comes running after Jacob, thinking that he has taken them. Of course, it wasn't Jacob that took them at all. It was Rachel. And the reason she took these household gods is probably not just to spite her father. It's most likely because these are the kinds of gods that she had worshipped all her life, and she was trying to take them with her for protection. It was what she knew, the religion and faith that she knew. And so that continues, of course, throughout Israel's existence and their experience. When they are called out of Egypt, right? When they're enslaved in Egypt, they hadn't known this God who was going to rescue them for quite a long time. This was their ancestors' God. And they were surrounded by a culture in which everybody was worshiping idols, and there's deities galore. But when God brings them out, he has to lay a foundation for the Israelites to introduce himself, if you will, to them. So he presents himself to Israel as a powerful deliverer who is worthy of their trust. So as they journey to Mount Sinai, God provides for them. He gives them food, he gives them shelter, he gives them water, he gives them protection from their enemies. And then we come to this famous scene at the foot of Mount Sinai. Remember, God appears in smoke and fire, and then he gives them the law. And this law is meant to reorient them from everything that they had known beforehand in paganism and idolatry. It teaches them how to worship and how to live. God wants to show them a different way. And so it's not surprising that the very first two commandments of the law are describing what would have been a novel concept in the ancient world. You see, God wanted to be worshipped exclusively as the only one, and without any kind of physical representation. No image, no idol, no statue at all. And so let's read here in Exodus chapter 20, verses 2 and following. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. Now this was unique among all the cultures around them, because for all the other peoples of the earth, there was a plurality of gods, and they were worshipped in multiple numbers. There was no exclusivity. You as a worshiper might have a favorite god, but that didn't exclude the worship of other gods. And they were always worshipped in the form of some kind of idol, a representation that helped you visualize the god, to help focus your attention. Yet this God, the God of the Jews, was seeking to be the primary God, the only God. He wants an exclusive relationship. So in Genesis 24, there's a covenant ceremony in which the Israelites pledge their faithfulness to Yahweh. They say, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. Yet remember what happens. Only a short time later, while Moses is up on the mountain with God, the people become impatient. Moses has been gone for quite a long time, and the Israelites begin to wonder, is he ever coming back? And so they begin to ask his brother Aaron to make gods for them, or to make an idol for them. After all, this was the form of religion that they'd been familiar with in Egypt. And so it's actually perhaps most likely that they're not worshiping the gods of Egypt, but they're now asking him to form an image of their new God. And so they're wanting to fall back into this form of idolatry that they knew because that was the way that they had always worshipped. And so soon after they enter into the promised land, we find that the Jews are continually falling into this habit of worshiping the gods of their neighbors. Let's look at Judges chapter 2. Then the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and they worshipped the Baals. And they abandoned the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. They followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were all around them, and they bowed down to them. And they provoked the Lord to anger. They abandoned the Lord and worshipped Baal and the Astartes. It's this story that we see throughout the Old Testament repeated again and again. Even the great King Solomon, remember his story, right? So he marries all of these foreign wives, which is meant to be kind of an act of diplomacy. But then all of those foreign wives, of course, encourage him to establish altars and places of worship for their home gods. And you have this problem of idolatry again. So ultimately, he was turning away from the God who had set him up as king. Now, what happens, of course, as a result of this continuous history of idolatry is that Israel gets punished for this. And so northern Israel, for example, in 721, the Assyrians come in and conquer them and take them away. And the reasons the prophets say for this are typically two things. Because they worshipped other gods and because they didn't take care of the poor. And then a little over 150 years later, southern Israel, Judea, is conquered by the Babylonians for exactly the same reasons, because of their idolatry. It just, again and again, was running out of control. Now, the extent of this problem in Israel is perhaps best illustrated by a text in 2 Kings 23. And I don't know if you're familiar with this story, but it's really interesting. Here you have a famous king, Josiah. Josiah orders some repairs on the temple. And while they're doing repairs of the temple, they run across this book that evidently had been lost. And most scholars now assume that the book that was lost, that they found, was Deuteronomy. Now, how in the world do you lose Deuteronomy? You know, that's your scripture. You don't have that many, right? Scriptural books. How do you lose one? But anyway, they found this, and what's interesting is they begin to read this book to Josiah, and he recognizes, we're not doing what this book says. And so he starts a nationwide reform, eliminating all the foreign objects of worship. So we have a description here in 2 Kings of how far Israel had sunk in their worship of other gods. So it's a rather long text, but let's read 2 Kings 23. The king commanded the high priest Hilkiah, the priest of the second order, and the guardians of the threshold to bring out of the temple of the Lord all the vessels made for Baal, for Asherah, and for all the host of heaven. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of the Kidron and carried their ashes to Bethel. He deposed the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained to make offerings in the high places in the cities of Judea and around Jerusalem, and those also who made offerings to Baal, to the sun, the moon, the constellations, and the host of heaven. He brought out the image of Asherah from the house of the Lord outside Jerusalem to the Wadi Kidron, burned it at the Wadi Kidron, beat it to dust, and threw the dust of it upon the graves of the common people. He broke down the houses of the male prostitutes that were in the house of the Lord, where the women did weaving for Asherah. The temple of God in Jerusalem had now become a house for all of these idols, for the idols of the Baals, for the idols of the Asherah, for all of these idolatrous practices. The kings of Israel had appointed priests of these foreign gods. They had so far moved away from and forgotten the identity of the God who had called them out of Egypt. How is it that a people who had been brought out of Egypt, out of slavery by the powerful, mighty arm of the Lord, how is it that they had forgotten all of this, had strayed so far from the covenant? Now, there's a whole host of reasons I could suggest, but I'm going to give you two today. I think, number one, they had allowed the cultures that surrounded them to define their priorities. You see, what happened was Israel had a mission from God, and they'd forgotten their mission. When God first calls the Israelites into a covenant relationship, He had done that for a very specific purpose. And that was because He wanted, not because He loved them more than He loved all the other nations, He wanted them to serve as kind of an intermediary, to show everybody else in the world what it looked like to be in relationship with God. He called them to be an instrument to save the nations. So look at Exodus chapter 19, 5 through 6. Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. Now what it means to be a priestly kingdom is to be a mediator. That's what a priest does. He mediates between the divine and the human. And so Israel was to be the priest for the other nations, to represent them, to show them what it looked like to be in relationship with this God, what God's original intention for all of creation was. They were to be a people that was characterized by justice and mercy and devotion to God, proclaiming to all their Creator. Yet rather than witnessing to the nations around them, they ended up becoming participants in what they were doing. Instead of being change agents, they themselves were changed. Rather than exerting influence, they were influenced. Secondly, in terms of the reasons this happened, I would say is a failure to trust. You see, what happened was, when the children of Israel entered into the land of Canaan, they were faced with a whole new challenge. Right? And so what happens is, of course, in Egypt they had been slaves. Now they were freed. But this is not the generation that actually came out of Egypt. All of those folks had died in the wilderness. This was an entirely new generation who enters the promised land. And as they begin to settle down and become farmers after this kind of wandering existence, they were farming the land, they were herding animals and so forth, there was this pressing fear of failure. They'd never done this before. How do we do this? Their very livelihood, their survival depended on successful crops, on the successful fertility of their herds. And the influence of polytheism was still strongly upon them. So as they entered this new land, it seemed prudent to them, at least, to call upon the gods of that land, or at least what they perceived to be the gods of that land. See, Baal was, after all, a fertility god. And what better way to curry the favor of good harvest, or to ensure good harvest, than to curry the favor of this god? And so they became participants in the rights of the Canaanites because it gave them a sense of control, a sense of security, that we can ensure our livelihood. So rather than trusting in the one who had rescued them from Egypt, they began to trust in others. All right, you might be asking, what does any of that have to do with us? I'm going to hazard a guess that none of you are hiding away some stone image at home that you bring out occasionally to worship and pray to. If you are, we'll talk later. Yet the practice of idolatry is just as real today than it was back then, although somewhat different in form. Modern day idolatry takes all kinds of different forms. You see, to participate in the practice of idolatry is to take anything that isn't God and put it in God's place. That's idolatry. There's a famous Protestant theologian, Paul Tillich, who is known for talking about this, and I'm going to use several quotes of his this morning. He says this in terms of idolatry. Faith consists in being vitally concerned with that ultimate reality to which I give the symbolic name of God. And so he's talking about what true faith is. Faith is when I look at the ultimate, what is most important, what is of true value, the thing that we call God, and I trust in that. As a result, idolatry results when we take something that is finite, that isn't that ultimate thing, and we give it value. We treat it as if it were infinite. Something that is limited, and we treat it as if it were limitless. So in Tillich's words, he says this: in true faith, the ultimate concern is a concern about the truly ultimate. While in idolatrous faith, preliminary, finite realities are elevated to the rank of ultimacy. Now that's kind of dense language, but what he's saying is, when we treat things that aren't God as if they're God, that's idolatry. And so over the next several weeks, I want to highlight some aspects of our culture that have kind of taken that place, that in our own culture we have elevated and put too much trust in. And here's where there's a clear difference from the situation of Israel. In the situation of Israel, their alternatives, the idols that they were worshiping, weren't really, didn't have any legitimate role at all in their lives. There was no reason for them to worship those. The things I'll be talking about, ideas and values that America has put forward, these aren't bad things in and of themselves. They're actually good things. The problem is when we put our trust in them as if they can serve us and redeem us and save us like God can. That's when it becomes. So it's a little bit more tricky. It's not as obvious as the Israelite problem with idols. So when success or money or security become the center of our lives, if that's what we're after, if that's what we're serving, what we're using our time and our resources for, they have become idols. And so we'll deal with several of those in turn. When we look at these various things to bring us meaning, to give our life worth and value, we've taken something that is finite and limited and we've given it ultimate reality. But only God is worth that. And so that's where I want you to think about in your own life what might take that place. So I would have us this morning learn two key lessons that we need to think of from their experience. First, we need to make sure that we don't let culture define us. Right? Like the Jews, Christians are called upon to be an influence. Peter echoes the language of the Old Testament when he says this in 1 Peter 2:9. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of Him who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light. We now, as the Christian church, are supposed to do what Israel was supposed to do and didn't. We are now the holy nation. We are the priestly people. We've been called to step into the breach and bring light into a dark world. We've been called to live our lives in such a way so that when people look at us, they say, oh, that's what life's about. That's what I'm supposed to be doing. That's what it looks like to be in relationship with the Creator. Yet oftentimes, I think we, instead of being the influencers, are influenced. And we allow the culture around us to define what is important, what matters, what's of value. And so I don't want us to come across as anti-worldly or anti-culture. As I said, a lot of these things are good. It's when we allow them to have too high a place in our lives that they become bad. So we have to be discerning critics. Quoting Tillich again, there are innumerable concerns in our lives and in human life generally which demand attention, devotion, passion. But they do not demand infinite attention, unconditional devotion, ultimate passion. They are important, often very important, for you and for me and for the whole of mankind. But they are not ultimately important. As Christians, we have to have clearly in mind what is of ultimate concern. Our priorities need to be, must be, kingdom priorities. And so through our lifestyle and actions, we should be modeling for others what is truly of ultimate concern, because when we're living just like them, then they don't see the truth. and we ourselves at times become blinded to the truth. The second lesson that we should learn from Israel is to trust in God alone. Oftentimes, the reason that these cultural values become idols to us is because we're looking for them to provide us fulfillment, to provide us happiness, to provide us meaning. Yet they cannot deliver the things that they promise. If we put our trust in anything besides God, we're bound to disappointment. Idols always disappoint. So let me share this one last quote from Tillich. The inescapable consequence of idolatrous faith is existential disappointment, a disappointment which penetrates into the very existence of man. The ecstatic character of even an idolatrous faith can hide this consequence only for a certain time. But finally, it breaks into the open, and the idol crumbles. Now, let me take a far more modern, contemporary, and mundane illustration. Anybody ever watch the infomercials on television? You've seen them. Perhaps you've even occasionally been drawn to maybe think about, maybe even actually buy something, right? But in these infomercials, what happens is they make these astonishing, almost outrageous claims to suck you in. You're like, wow! That's fantastic! That's tremendous! And so, this is, however, a product that has no hope of delivering what it actually promises and what it claims to. So you get this hyped up product, and you eventually shell out the money for it, and you're excited about it, and you're anxiously waiting for its delivery, and then it finally comes in the mail, only to find it's some cheap plastic doodad that doesn't really do anything. And that's what an idol is. It promises far more than it could ever deliver. It's just a cheap plastic doodad. And it won't save you. So how do you know if you have idols in your life? Have the praise team come up as I finish with these questions. Questions I would ask. Where do I invest the majority of my time and energy? That could be physical energy, but it could also be emotional energy. Which of these things could I not live without? And what have I put my trust in? And then finally, what is your ultimate concern? And is it truly ultimate? That's how you know. Let's continue to worship.